Yeah, so that's good. Oh, now streaming live on YouTube. Cool. I just saw a little note pop up. So how many of these have you done, Priyush?
So I'll start. We started this webinar series around 2 years back, and till now we have done 100 plus webinar sessions.
Oh my gosh, that's impressive.
Yeah.
And you have speakers from, so I'm pretty sure Matt Anderson spoke for you guys, right?
Yes, Matt spoke to me. Greg, we recently did a session with Greg. I hope we both are good friends.
Oh, Greg Prickrell?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Yeah, we're friends.
Yeah, we have done webinar with both of them as well. So we have done webinars with speakers from across the globe, from some amazing brands like Google, Facebook as well. And
Nice.
we keep on doing these webinar sessions every week. So 1 or 2 sessions every week are lined up. So there are 4 or 5 another sessions lined up for the upcoming month. I'll share link of that as well after this session with the
Okay,
audience.
good. Yeah. And do you have anything you want to present before I get started?
Yes,
I mean, we're
yes.
not.
So I would like to just introduce pragmatic leaders a little bit.
Okay,
Before
good. Yep. You can totally do that whenever you're ready to take over the presentation. You can totally do that.
Right. So we have 3 minutes. So let's wait for 2-3 minutes more.
Yep, sure. Not a problem. Yeah, so this is great. Thank you for inviting me to come and talk about storytelling.
It's a pleasure. So can you tell us a little bit about your this podcast series that you are running right now and the book, how your idea of writing a book came up?
Right. So I've been a product manager for since the mid 90s, which is like 30 years now or something. It's ridiculous. It's, I guess, 25, no, 30 years, something like that. Anyway, a really long time. And when I started, there were no books about product management. Nobody really knew what it was. And it took me a long time to figure it out. And I always felt like, oh, there were people that were doing it. And it seemed like they knew something that I didn't do. So it's like, I thought there must be a secret book somewhere, a secret handbook on how to be a product manager. And of course, there wasn't really a secret product manager handbook. But as I did it for many years and I learned a bunch of stuff, and I was also the product manager for a tool for product managers. So my customers were product managers for quite a long time. I learned enough that I felt like, well, I have a lot of information I could share about what product management is all about. And in 2017 or so, I had some time. And so I put together a bunch of the articles that I'd written for my blog, and then added a bunch of new material and put that together in the Secret Product Manager Handbook. And it's really structured around the fundamental. Well, one of the things that I did was I came up with this fundamental framework for what product management is all about. If you think about product management, the basic question of product management is, what should we build, right? That's the fundamental product management question. But then how do you figure that out? Well, the way that you figure it out is the thing that you should build should be a solution to a problem that is significant. And what that means for a problem to be significant is that enough people have the problem and are willing to pay for a solution that it's worth building something to solve it. So you have this situation where if you think about the fundamental decision is based on, sorry, I just hit my microphone. The fundamental decision is based on, I found a market problem that's worth solving. I'm going to build a solution to that, right? The product manager doesn't build the solution, but we help guide that creation of the solution. And then of course we have to take it to market. We have to be able to find the people that have that problem. We have to convince them that our solution is better than their alternatives and all that kind of stuff. And again, we do that through other people. We do that through sales and marketing. And so the book is structured around this framework of finding market problems, creating solutions to those problems, and taking them to market. And this talk today is about, it's really part of that going to market part. Primarily, storytelling is a really important part of go to market. But it also turns out to be really important throughout the rest of the process as well. And I'll talk about that. So the storytelling stuff, I don't really have anything on storytelling in the book, but the stuff I'm going to talk about today really ties back into that fundamental framework that's in the book.
Great. That's really interesting. And I believe we can start now. We are already on time.
Okay, good. Yeah. So you want to start? You can. I will stop sharing, or do you just want to? Can you? Whoops.
Uh, yeah.
Let's see. I will
So
stop. There we go.
welcome everyone to Product Talk series by Pragmatic Leaders. We are glad to see you all here. And before we begin with the today's session, I would like to give you all a little brief about Pragmatic Leaders. At Pragmatic Leaders, you all are part of a global family of aspirational professionals who proactively help each other and are invested in each other's career growth. Pragmatic Leaders functions like a full stack global career accelerator that rests on three core pillars. Pillar one is educate. We help you upskill via our proven courses and professional industry coaches. Pillar two is engage. We run a global community of product managers on Slack with access to online and offline meetups. Pillar three is employ. We operate a job platform and dedicated interview preparation courses to help you crack your dream job. So, with that note, let's begin the session now. And uh, Nils had already given a little introduction about him, but yeah, Nils, I would like you to take the session forward from here. Really
Okay,
excited.
very good. Well, let me get started then. So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm having a little tiny bit of a problem navigating because my mouse is disappeared. But let me know when you can see my screen, if you can see it.
It's
Oh,
visible now.
it says you can. Okay, very good. So yeah, thanks for welcoming, Paresh. Thanks for inviting me to this. I'm going to give a short talk about essentially storytelling for product managers. And I don't know how many of you were on one just a few minutes ago when I was talking about my background and the book that I wrote and things like that. So I've been a product manager for about 35 years, apparently, when I do the math, which is kind of amazing to me. When I started it, there were no books, there was no training, there were no organizations like this for how to be a product manager. I had to learn that all on the job. A few years ago, I took a lot of the things that I learned and I put them into this book called The Secret Product Manager Handbook. And I've learned a lot of other things since then that I continue to share on my podcast, All the Responsibility, None of the Authority, which of course describes what we do in product management. And a lot of what I've been focusing on since I wrote the book actually was thinking about storytelling and how important storytelling is to go to market. And I talk about go to market a lot in my podcast and on the blog and things like that. Storytelling is a really important part of that. Storytelling also ties into all the other things we do as product managers as well. So I'll talk a little bit about my story from storytelling. So let me tell you a story about my story about storytelling. I've always struggled with storytelling actually since I was young. In fact, at one time I had this ambition to become a filmmaker. And I'm a very technical person, so I can easily master the technical skills of making films, setting up shots and things like that. What I found I struggled with was the storytelling. What should my stories be about? And it took me a very long time to come to the realization that there actually is a very simple structure for storytelling. It took many, many years, and it finally was actually in a career training workshop that I took where I finally learned the fundamental structure of how to tell a story. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, that fundamental structure, and then how to apply it to product management tasks. But as a result of learning that, it's really opened up a whole range of things for me in terms of understanding some things about why products are successful and why products aren't, or why sales efforts are successful and why they aren't. It's helped me understand better how to find those market problems that we need to solve as product managers, and then how to convince maybe my senior executives the value of solving those problems. It all involves storytelling. And so storytelling has become a really important part of what I pitch as a fundamental skill for product managers, and of course what I use for myself. Now, the interesting thing about me, storytelling, of course, one of the fundamental components of a story is a problem. There's always this fundamental problem that needs to be solved. And my life is pretty good, so I don't have that many stories about my actual life because my life doesn't have many problems. But my customers' lives tend to have a lot more problems. And one of the things that I'll show you how to do is also figure out how to make your customers' problems sound worse, because actually they're typically very bad, and and we often, one of the problems we have as product managers is we don't do a good job of articulating the problems. And I'll talk about all of that. So if you think about how to be successful in business, a huge part of that is about persuading people to do things. So things like, I need to get somebody to fund my project or fund my new feature or fund my new module that I want to put into my product, or I want them to select my feature over somebody else's feature in terms of what gets funded. So that's something that a story that some persuasion that I'd want to do internally in my company. Another thing is, of course, I want people to buy my product. How do I do that? Well, I have to persuade them that my product is a better choice for them than the other alternatives that they could choose, whether that's actually not even buying a product at all or buying a competitor's product. I want them to choose mine. That's a persuasion job. I want people to read my ads, right? If I'm a marketing person, I want to make my ad so compelling that people will take a look at it, and then they'll know about me, and maybe they'll write in or they'll click on the link that will send them to the sales page where they can then buy my product. And then, of course, I have to go through that whole selling process. And of course, we also, all of us have to occasionally sell ourselves. We want people to hire us for whatever reason. We might want people to give us a promotion, something like that. And again, these are all persuasion things. So the fundamental tool of persuasion, one of the most fundamental tools, is stories. And I'm going to talk about why that's true. I'm going to talk about, for product managers, which particular stories are the ones that we should focus on learning to tell. Now, there's a lot of different kinds of stories you can tell, but there's 3 particular ones that we need as product managers. I'm going to tell you how to tell a story, and I'm going to give you a simple structure for that and give you some ideas about how to improve the quality of your stories. And what quality of a story really means is how compelling it is. Can you get people to listen to it? And then I'm going to give you a few guidelines on how to, having developed these stories, how to use them to do all the things that I just mentioned. Help sell your project, help sell your product, all those sorts of things, help sell yourself. So the fundamental challenge we have whenever you're trying to get people to do something or to learn something new is that the human brain has been exquisitely evolved to ignore new information coming in unless it's about danger, right? If there's a tiger next to you, your brain's going to pay attention to the tiger, and otherwise your brain just basically says, don't bother me. And there's this wall. So I've got a kind of a picture of a wall here between this person is trying to impart some information, this person on the left trying to impart some information to me, but I don't want to, my brain's default is I'm not going to listen to that information because I've got to pay attention to danger. And so I'm just going to ignore. Now, the thing about stories is that they kind of break down that wall. So if I start to say, well, let me tell you a story. And I just did that. I told you a story about my story for storytelling, about my path to storytelling. And that probably made your ears perk up a little bit. And that's true of any story, right? If you say, let me tell you a story, or once upon a time, or this is something that happened, oftentimes that can break down that barrier into the brain, and it lets people get through. So that's sort of the fundamental reason to think about why we need to tell stories. And of course, what keeps people listening to stories is, are they good and are they compelling and things like that. And we'll talk about how to make that happen. But just simply the structure of a story is very compelling to the human brain. Now, this is obviously an oversimplification, but it's an oversimplification, but it's quite a useful abstraction to use when you're thinking about trying to get information out into the market. So for example, if you have a great new product and you tell people, oh, let me tell you about my great new product, it goes really fast and it has these features. Well, that's when that brain barrier is up. That's when that big wall is up. And so you need to put those, if you want people to listen to you talk about your product, you have to put that stuff into the form of a story, and it will make it much more likely that the person you're talking to will actually listen to you, right? So if you have a lot of features, you want to put the features in terms of a story about how somebody was suffering, for example, and by using this feature, they're no longer suffering. And I'll talk to you about how that works. So if we think about the 3 key stories that product managers need to tell, they are the following. First of all, of course, we have to be able to tell customer stories. These are the stories of our successful customers who they had some problem and they found eventually our solution, and that solution has caused them to have a transformation of some kind. This is often called a hero's journey, this type of story, and you use it for selling, you use it for addressing objections, use it for reducing the perception of risk, a whole lot of things. And I'll talk about the fundamental framework of a customer story. There's also the prospect story. Now, the prospect, of course, they haven't bought anything from us yet, and so they're still suffering from that problem. And this is really more of a tragedy. You can use this story for a lot of different things. You can certainly use it in sales. When you're talking to a prospect, you can say to this, you can ask the prospect about their story, right? Are they suffering from this particular problem, and ask them what the outcomes of that are. But you can also use it for things like pitching a new product idea internally. You can say to your executive team, let me tell you a story about some people out in the market that are suffering and how we can alleviate that suffering. And then there's, of course, your own personal stories. And I said your personal story, but it's really your stories about what you've done. Like if you want to pitch yourself as a product manager, you're going to have to be able to tell stories about things like how you worked with a difficult person, or how you showed innovation, or how you solved a problem that no one else could solve. And you're going to use those when you do your interviews and things like that. So those are the three stories that we really need to handle. There's a lot of other stories as well that you might use in the course of being a person in business. Like you might have a story about your company and the origin story of your company. That's a typical one. And there's a lot of other types of stories, but these are the three fundamental product management specific stories. So now you're thinking, okay, that sounds good. What do I do about that? And the fact is that there is actually a formula for telling stories, and there's a set of questions that you can use to help get to the fundamental components of that story and to make the story really good. So let me talk a little bit about that. So there's a very basic story structure. Now you may have heard of things like Joseph Campbell, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and all of these. You may have read books. If you were like me, you may have read books about screenwriting to try to understand how to tell stories. But underneath all of those things, and something that took me a long time to find, there's a really basic story structure that makes it very simple to tell it makes it very simple and easy to tell a story. It you know that stories always have a beginning, a middle, and end. To me, that didn't help me, because of course, obviously they have a beginning, a middle, and end, but I didn't know what to put in those. But it turns out that the easiest way to create a beginning is to talk about some problem that the customer has, some problem that the prospect is facing, some problem that you had or were given, depending on the type of story. Or it also might be some kind of an opportunity that you want to achieve that you can't. And so that's the beginning. The setup of the story is this bad thing was happening, or I couldn't achieve this thing that I wanted to achieve. The middle of the story is the search for the solution. This is where you talk, if you're telling your own story, this is where you share how great you are, basically, because you're so smart and you figured out a solution. In a customer story, it's a little bit different. In the customer story, they start with this problem they're facing. It's maybe if it's a story about a business problem, then they're having this business problem. Maybe they can't make sales, something like that. And they search and search and search for a solution. And it's a big quest. And they can't find a solution until maybe at the end they find a solution. And the end of the story is that they found the solution. And not only did they solve the problem, but they had some kind of a transformation. And the transformation is really important. And I'll talk about the types of transformations that you can typically find, for example, in customer success stories. So this structure is very effective. It works for all kinds of stories. And once you start to learn this structure, you're going to start seeing it everywhere. You're going to start seeing it in movies. This is every successful movie is structured like this or some variation of this. I'll talk a little about one key variation that many movies include when we talk about making the story better. But this is the structure of most stories. And if you will start to see this everywhere. And if you see a story that doesn't have this structure, where there's a problem, there's a difficult search for a solution, and then there's a transformation at the end, that means it's not a very good story. And actually, it turns out that lots of customer success stories that you see published, like if you go to a company's website and they have a selection of customer success stories, and you read those, you're going to sometimes find that the stories don't have some of these components. They might not talk much about a transformation. They might not talk about a difficult search for a solution. And so these are some ways you can improve your story and make it better. So this structure, as I say, works for most stories. You can think of it mnemonically as PSR, for problem, solution, results. It's a good way to think about how these stories go. And the results, of course, are always that the problem was solved and that there was a transformation. So let me give you an example of a true but very boring story. I'll tell you a story about this time that I was really hungry. I was really hungry. And so I went to the store and I bought some food and I made a sandwich. And as a result, I was no longer hungry and I could get back to work. Okay. So this is a true story. You've probably all experienced this story on a daily basis. Maybe you don't always go to the store for the solution, but you make yourself a sandwich, right? Now, this is boring. Why is it boring? Well, because first of all, if you think about the different things that are going on in this story, for one thing, it's the problem isn't very bad. This is a very common problem. We all know how to solve this problem. Doesn't take much of a challenge. The solution, of course, there wasn't much work involved in this solution. It was a very simple, straightforward solution. I didn't have to struggle. I didn't have to do a difficult search. It didn't show that I had any specific skills. And of course, the results, not much of a transformation. I was no longer hungry. That happens to me multiple times a day when I'm not hungry anymore. So not a very good story. Now, some technologists might think, and we're all technologists, of course. When I say the word technologist, I mean us folks that like technology. We're analytical, we're quantitative, we like facts and numbers, and we love to add those. And so we could try to improve that story by putting in some facts. Well, I was hungry, I hadn't eaten for 4 hours. And I went to the store and I bought a half a pound of bread and a quarter pound of cheese, and I made myself a sandwich. And I ate the sandwich, and then for the rest of the day, for the next 4 hours, I was great, right? That doesn't make the story less boring because it's still basically a boring story. It's a boring situation. So what are the keys to a good story? Well, the keys are that the problem should be really bad. That's the number one thing. It should be ideally, and particularly this is true if you're thinking about a story about some business problem. So I'm a business to business product manager, right? So my customers are businesses, and when they buy my product, they're spending a huge amount of money, right? They're spending thousands of dollars, maybe tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars. And in order to be willing to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on a solution, you have to have a very big problem, right? I mean, think about when you have to spend $100 on something. You probably think about that a lot, and you probably, do I really have this problem? Is this really worth solving? All these questions. Well, if you're a business and you're about to drop $10,000 or $50,000 or $100,000 on something, you better have a really good reason for doing that. And that means that your problem needs to be really bad. Now, we often think of these types of business problems as normal. My sales aren't growing, right? Oh, that's a normal problem. A lot of businesses have that problem. But what is the impact of that problem if it doesn't get solved? Well, it's really bad. The company goes out of business. A bunch of people get laid off, right? So even a sort of normal business problem, like my sales aren't growing as fast as I want, that is fundamentally a dire problem. And if you simply say as the problem, oh, my sales weren't growing, then that doesn't make it sound bad enough. And I'm going to talk about how to make the problem sound worse. But the good news is that if you have a successful product that you have successful customers with, they were facing a dire problem before they bought your product. And if they're happy, that problem got solved. So the second thing is that the solution needs to actually be some amount of work, right? So again, if you're thinking about a business success story, the story gets a lot better if your customer, who now is successful, had a really hard time finding a solution, right? They tried a bunch of things. Maybe they tried to build their own solution. They tried some of your competitors' products and they failed, right? That's the type of thing that makes a really good story, right? That the solution was challenging. And then, of course, the results need to be transformational and ideally somewhat unexpected. So, for example, if you're, again, going back to this idea of our sales were not growing, they tried a lot of different things and then they finally found your solution, and then their sales started growing. Well, that's okay, but it's not really transformational. I mean, it does keep the company from going under. But you're looking for things like, oh, and because I was able to find this and implement it, I got a promotion. If your person that your customer got promoted, your customer maybe didn't get fired. That's a very important one. Or your customer became the expert and actually was assigned to do this for multiple different divisions in the company. That's the kind of transformation you want to look for. Not just that, oh, we solved the tech, we numerically solved the problem, but in the course of that process, the storyteller was transformed in some way. And often that's unexpected. For example, when I talked to a customer of a client once, and they said, not only did they improve their business process a bunch, but they became known as the experts in this business process, which they hadn't been known before. So the organization had gained a lot of respect within the company, and that was an unexpected and, of course, very gratifying result, and personally meaningful to the people in the company. So let's take that story that I just told that was boring and show you how you would make a similar story about sort of a similar situation, but what it would take to make it into a great story. So I was hungry. In fact, I hadn't eaten for 3 days. And I couldn't get out of the house because of my broken leg, and it was starting to get infected. And the reason I couldn't get out of the house is because there was a bunch of wolves around the door, and we were locked in, and I was a 5-hour walk from anywhere. Right. So now this is a good enough setup now, good enough problem now to actually make a movie. As opposed to the old one, which was just, I was hungry, I went to the store, right? So this is just illustrates how you need to make the problem dire. And of course, the solution, if you can imagine, I'm not going to go into the solution to this story because it obviously involve, a lot of pain, dragging my broken leg through the snow, killing the wolves, or somehow getting rid of the wolves, blah, 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 all these things. The solution to this story is very difficult. I'm not going to get into that. But the point is that you can see the difference between the original story and this one. There's quite a lot of difference. Okay, so let's now tie this into your customer story. And I talked about this some already. So obviously they have a terrible problem that they're suffering from. It's costing them money. It may be the business may be about to fail, or they may be about to be acquired by somebody they don't want to be acquired by. They've tried a lot of things, none of which worked, and they continue searching for a solution. Then they found your solution. And now, of course, they're happy and they've transformed, and everybody got promotions, and all the salespeople are now going to club because they are now beating their quota, all that kind of stuff. So that is the type of thing that you want to achieve with your story. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that make that story better. And I've talked about some of this already, but when I talk to technologists, people like us, product managers, technical people, we really struggle the most with the problem and the results. So I've already talked about how a boring problem means your story will be boring. And so how do you make the problem sound bad? And as I said, you can go into this, if it's a business problem and somebody's willing to spend a bunch of money to solve it, you can be confident that the problem is bad, and it's not just, oh, we can't grow sales, right? And you can ask a bunch of questions. So I've got a list of questions here, and I have a cheat sheet, a customer success story cheat sheet that you can download, and I'll put a link. We'll figure out how to get you guys a link to that. Actually, I can tell you how to find it. I'm pretty sure that if you go to secretpmhandbook.com/stories, you can find that cheat sheet. You can download it. So the point is that there's a bunch of questions you can ask to get to the root. So you're talking to your customer, your successful customer, and you say, I would like to learn about your story about how you found our product, and I might use that for, as a reference sale to help me sell when I talk to new prospects. So the types of things you're going to want to ask are, what would have happened if you hadn't solved the problem? So again, if it's this example of our sales aren't growing, what happens if you don't solve that problem? Well, a couple different things. One is, if that person is a sales manager, probably they get fired. Another thing is, if the company continues to not grow sales, they probably go out of business and a bunch of people get laid off, and so on and so forth. You can ask, how much would that have cost? What would have been the dollar impact of that problem continuing to exist? What's the impact of doing nothing, right? That's another way of asking the same thing. What does it mean for your job? You can ask this type of set of questions to get to the really deep parts and personally impacting parts of the story. Now, you can also always ask this great question or the statement at the end, whenever they answer your question, so what would have happened if you hadn't solved the problem? Well, I guess, you know, it would have been a problem for the company. Oh, well, tell me more about that. Tell me more is a great tool for getting deeper in your discovery. So this is obviously a type of discovery, right? You're discovering what the situation was of the customer before they became your customer. Now, these same sets of questions actually you can use when you're doing market discovery to try to find new problems to solve, right? You got to people in your market and you say, oh, well, tell me about the thing you're struggling with the most. And they'll say, well, our sales aren't growing. And you say, oh, tell me more about that. What would happen if you don't solve that problem? Oh, that's very interesting. Tell me more. What was the impact of doing nothing? Oh, and what will happen to your job if you don't do anything? Oh, well, tell me more about that. And so on and so forth, right? I'm doing the whole dialogue here, one man dialogue. But the point is that these are really powerful questions, both for customer stories and actually for that prospect story that I talked about, the tragedy. Because remember that the customer story, until they found your solution, was a tragedy. It was a tragedy for them. They were unsuccessful. Things were going bad, or they were almost going to go bad. So how do you add emotion and drama? So some things to think about. Think about when you're talking about the solution portion of the story, talking about the things that they tried that didn't work. And this is potentially competitors' products. This is potentially things that they tried to build. And your solution is the last thing they tried. And of course, at that point, they were successful. Now, you also want to have, of course, concrete results. And concrete means quantitative, right? So, our sales started growing by 10% every quarter, right? That's a concrete result. And a quantitative result. It's actually not that interesting to people. Quantitative results are actually not very interesting normally to people. They don't have a emotional kind of connection. And so you also want to include the results like, oh, I got a promotion, right? Which is a concrete result, but it's much more emotionally engaging for your audience than just simply saying there was a 10% improvement. Of course, you can also talk about the fact that the company didn't go out of business, So generally speaking, most quantitative results and kind of business results are not that dramatic and they're not that emotionally engaging. You still want to have them in your story, but they can't be the only thing. Now, there are some exceptions to this. If you make something 10 times better, or you make a problem go 100% away, that can be very emotionally compelling as well. So those are sort of the outlier quantitative results. They're so big that they actually are meaningful. But really, you get the drama from things like somebody being promoted or becoming the expert or getting recognition. These are really personal results that come from that arose from the having implemented the change. So that's one important set of things you can do when you're thinking about how to make this story better. So another thing you can do to help make the story better is what I've heard called the vertical takeoff. So this is actually, I got this from some guy who had a storytelling training. And I didn't think the rest of the training was that good, but this part of it was really good. And the vertical takeoff is essentially the way you get into the story. And you talk about a bad thing is going to happen if we don't do something, or that there's this bad thing that's happening over and over again. And if we don't solve it, things are going to go bad. And so an example of that is like this idea of our sales are flat. So a vertical takeoff that I've used in a story that I tell about my own experience is I say, our sales were tanking. We were missing quota every quarter for the past 3 quarters. And if we didn't do something about it, our company was going to go under, right? So that's a bad thing that was happening over and over again. We weren't making quota. And the results were going to be, if that bad thing continued, it was going to cause a lot of problems. Like the company was going to go out of business. So then the rest of my story is about how we fixed that, and how then at the end, how sales started growing. And so that makes a great story structure. So again, concrete results. One of the most important things is when you mention some kind of a challenge in the problem section, right? So for example, if you say, I thought I might lose my job, then it's really nice if you can then tie that to something in the results section, like, oh, I got a promotion, or I got a raise, or I got recognition, right? And so it's ideally, and you can think about movies that you see, right? Whenever something happens in a movie, whenever something bad happens in a movie, or you meet some new character in the movie, there's always some way that that person is, or that situation is tied off at the end, right? And it makes a bad movie if there's random people coming in who don't somehow get explained by the end. And the same is true of your story. You want to get all those challenges into your story, into the problem part, and then you want to make sure that they're all addressed by the end. And so that's something that you can think about. How do you pay off all of those challenges? And again, well, I've given some examples. And again, so I kind of talked about those two things. Now, one advanced topic on a story. So one thing you'll often see in Hollywood movies is what's called the reversal. So there's an initial problem. And you can think about this if you're familiar with the movie Die Hard or the movie The Rock. I don't know if you have those out there. I'm sure that the Bollywood movies also have these, by the way. So there's a problem, and somebody goes and tries to solve this problem. And then in the course of trying to solve the problem, they find that there's some other underlying problem that's much worse. And this turns out to be a super effective story structure. You see it in lots of Hollywood movies, especially Hollywood blockbusters. They all have this structure. And if you are able to do that in your story, then that can be very, very compelling. It's not necessary for your basic customer success stories and things, but if in the course of exploring your story, you find that it can be really powerful. So the other thing is that sometimes you have to set up the situation before getting to the problem. This is actually not that common. It's much better to use a vertical takeoff. But if you do have to set something up, don't spend a lot of time on that. Okay. So I'm going to stop and see if there's any questions. I don't know. Let's see. Maybe Priyesh, are you moderating the questions? Are there any questions that I should be answering at this point, coming in chat or anything?
So right now we don't have any questions coming up in chat. We can there is one question from Manda. I'll speak the question for you.
Thank you.
If there is visualized accepted solution, then how do you backtrack with beginning and middle in case of critical product development process?
I think I'll need a little bit more clarification on that question. So the idea is that we've already got a solution and we want to figure out what the problem is. I'm not quite sure of the question.
Yes, Mandar, you can also speak up. It will be better.
Okay, so I guess the question is, okay, so I've decided on I'm going to build something. And then you say, well, okay, I'm going to build this thing. Why should I build it? That's essentially, it's a common problem. It's what we call a solution in search of a problem. And it is actually something that is not a good practice, generally speaking. Now, what you can do is, the thing is, it's really terrible to build something that nobody wants. And what nobody wants, and when you think, what does nobody want mean? It means that the problem that it solves is either not interesting to people, or it's not worth spending money on, or they don't even actually have the problem. So what you need to do, so how do you create a great story for a new product or technology that doesn't have a customer yet? So you're working on creating the first customer program. So what you need to do is, it's not a great situation to be in, to be honest, unless you already went out to the market. So the question is, why are you building this product? Are you building this product because you went out to the market and you discovered there was this unsolved problem? If so, then you can use the story of that unsolved problem that you learned from your prospects or from your discovery process, and create a story around that. If you don't have a customer yet, then that's fine. You just need to find other customers who are like the people that you talked to who had those problems. So the challenge is, if you have a solution and you didn't do market discovery beforehand, and you just said to yourself, oh, this seems like it would be neat to build, or I think there's a problem and I'm going to build a solution to it, without going and validating in the market that there's actually a problem, that's where you're going to have a challenge. And sometimes you can be lucky. and actually find a problem that your solution solves that's important to the market. But it's kind of risky to do it. That's why so much of product management training nowadays is about going to the market, doing market discovery, and figuring out what are the real problems that are unsolved out there that I can solve better than the competitors, right? So let's say that you did that, right? But you don't have any customers yet because you just finished building the solution, or you haven't finished. So then what you would do is you would go out and you would say, okay, I talked to a bunch of people in the market and they said they had this problem and they needed it solved, and they're willing to spend money to solve it, and they can't find a good solution today. So then who do you want to sell to? Well, you want to sell to people that are like those people you talk to. And so your marketing program is, how do I find people like that? And then that's the first part. The second part is, how do I tell them about this solution that I have? Well, you start with saying, oh, if you have this problem that I'm pretty confident you have, we should talk about how I can solve that for you, right? It's not like saying, oh, let me tell you about the features I have. It's about saying, oh, you have a problem and I have a solution to it. So that is the way that you would approach. So I'm seeing a lot of questions coming in. Hopefully that answered the question about a great story for a new product that doesn't have a customer yet. You really need to understand what that problem is that your product solves, and make sure that there's people that have that problem, and that you understand what the pains are of that problem, and how your solution will transform their experience. So and this is true if you're a product consulting organization as well. So if somebody comes to you and says, I want you to build this product for me, your due diligence should include, well, tell me why you think this product will be successful. Tell me about what research you did to make sure there's a market for this product, right? Because that's on behalf of your client. You're really asking that question, because it's going to fail. No products are successful if they don't solve a problem for the market. That just is true. There's a lot, you don't hear that much about problems that don't solve problems for the market. And the reason you don't hear about those is because they fail before you even get to know their names, right? If you think about, you can name any successful product in the market, and I can tell you the story about about the problem that product solves and why it solves it better than their alternatives. So if you have a story which actually solves a problem, which involves a great nexus, and the company hesitates to invest time and money, how can you create a story that actually convinces them to take the risk? So this is a great question. So first of all, so I would start, when I'm thinking about how I might present this product idea to the executives who have to decide which products to fund, right? So first of all, hopefully in your company, there's lots and lots of product ideas coming in, and they're all good. They've all been validated with that there's actually a market for the solution, things like that. And so you're competing on a head-to-head basis. So the first thing I would do, though, is make sure that I can articulate the story of the prospect, right? What is the problem they have? What is the pain? What's going to be the results of this problem if it's not solved? What have they done to try to solve it, right? Because you want to make sure that the prospects are actually trying to solve this problem, because if they aren't trying to solve it, if they just say, yeah, this is a pain, but we live with it, you want to find people that are trying to solve the problem, because that suggests that they might be willing to spend money on a solution. And ideally, they've actually tried to buy something and it failed. That's really good. And then you can say, so that's the first part of your presentation to the executives. The second part of your presentation is, and here's why we can solve this problem unlike the competitors, right? Here's why we can offer these prospects a solution that's a better alternative than the alternatives that they have today, right? And it might be that because you're the first one to try to solve it. It might be because you have some technology that's better than the competitors. There's a lot of different reasons. And of course, at that point, then you have to make a little bit of a business model that says, and here's how much money we'll make, right? And here's how we'll reach these people. You want to have a little bit of a marketing model as well. How can we make sure that we can reach these people and convince them that we have their solution? So that's how you need to sell that. And then, so you're going to use that story as part of your persuasion to the executives to tell them, to convince them that they should invest in your product versus some other product that they could invest in. Now, if everybody on your product management organization is really good at telling stories, then, that's going to be your competition, right? But if you go into the executives and just say, hey, there's this $3 billion opportunity and you should fund it, that's not going to work. You have to put some stories around it. And so, as Vinay says, sell the problem you solve, not the product. Of course, that is totally true. Sometimes there's an undiscovered need from the customers when the product is released. Then probably customers realize they probably needed it previously and they are operating before without it. Right? That's a great thing. And it's often, sometimes you get your first customers, they buy it because maybe they're ambitious or they're leading edge and they kind of want to get something that is new and things like that. Sometimes this happens. And then it's really worthwhile to go back to them and find out what value they really got from the product, right? If they're really successful, they said, we really love it. And then you want to find out actually some really important things, like how do they talk about the product to them? What is this product, right? There's a book by, well, her name will come to April Dunford. She just wrote a book about product positioning called Obviously Awesome. And she tells this story, which is a great story. She was working for a company that had a database solution and they were trying to sell it as a database solution. And all their prospects said, we don't need a database solution. We already have a database. They did have a few successful customers and they went and talked to the successful customers and said, well, tell me about how you're using our database solution. And they said, oh, you mean your business analytics solution? Because the successful customers were using it for business analytics in a way that they could not use their existing database. And so when they changed the way that they talked about the product to the market as a business analytics solution as opposed to a database, they were suddenly much more successful. And this is one of the things you can get from talking to customers as well. This is not really part of the storytelling aspect. This is not really part of storytelling per se. This is more about making sure that you're speaking in the language that the customers understand. And you may be using words that they understand, but they may not think your product with the same words that you do. And so you need to figure out what is the positioning in your customer's mind about your product, particularly if they're successful. So I did get a question here about, could we give 3 examples, like bad, moderate, good, of storytelling that would be much. So I gave a story, an example of a bad I'm hungry story, right? I'm hungry, I made a sandwich, now I'm not hungry. That's a bad story. The good story is, I was starving, I was stuck in a cabin in the woods with a broken leg and surrounded by wolves. That's a pretty good story. That's a movie level story. So a moderate story might be something along the lines of, I did actually start to think about this. It's really hard to come up with a compelling story about I'm hungry, to be honest, unless you make it really bad. So, but I thought of one like, somebody is, he's doing a weekend writing retreat in a cabin that he rented, and he's going with a friend. The friend is driving separately, and he gets to the cabin and there's no food there. And suddenly, his friend calls and says, I can't make it. And his friend was the one who's going to bring the food. So that would actually be an interesting story, right? How does the person then get some food, right? There's no neighbors anywhere around. The stores are all closed. It's an interesting story. That might be a moderate level story about I'm hungry, because it's an actual big challenge. It's not life threatening, right? The guy's going to survive, but it is an actual challenge, right? That person is going to have to do something clever and intelligent and smart and creative in order to find some food in that situation. So that would be an example of that. Hopefully that's helpful. Yeah. So how do you tell a story to an audience where the problem involves them or their decisions, actions, without hurting their sensitivities? Now, this is a really good question, and I don't know if I have a really great answer off the top of my head. It really depends on the audience. A lot of it depends on the power differential between you and the audience. If you're trying to tell your executives that they're doing stupid things, that's a very different situation than if you're trying to work with your dev team to get their processes better, right? And so I don't really have a good answer for that, sort of, as I say, off the top of my head. Let me think about it a little bit. If I might come back to it if I come up with some other ideas. So let me now move along. So that was great. A lot of good questions, and I will come back to some questions toward the end. Let me see what time it is. Oh my gosh, 15 minutes left. So let me talk about how you use these stories. So the customer success stories, how do you use these? Well, obviously you can use them as a piece of collateral, right? You can write this 2-page collateral about your customer's success, and that'll be great. And it's much, if you look at many of those that are out there, you can find a lot of them, on companies' websites. A lot of them are not that good, right? They don't really get too much into the problem. They don't talk too much about the solution, the effort to find a solution, things like that. They don't talk too much about the transformation. So those are all opportunities for you to make your customer success story collateral better. But basically, so you're going to have this, you're going to talk about a problem, you're going to talk about a solution, you're going to talk about the results. Now, the place to use these in addition to collateral is, of course, in the sales process and actually in the marketing process as well. So how do you use them in the marketing process? Well, the way you use them in the marketing process is you have essentially a one-liner that says, for example, something about the fact that, you have a customer who got a raise and got a promotion because they started taking market share from their competitors thanks to your product, right? Obviously, this is not a headline in the form that it's in right now, but you can imagine a headline of an ad or a pop-up or a hero image on your site that talked about, one of your customers, and you don't even have to give them a name, and you don't have to have a picture. If you can do that, that's great, who got a raise because of your product, right? That's a great way to get people to come to your website to say, oh, I'm interested in getting a raise and I have that problem too. So maybe I should take a look, right? That's what your goal is in when you're doing marketing is to build some interest, right? If you think about, there's a great acronym for marketing, AIDA, AIDA, attention, interest, desire, action. And the role of marketing is really to obviously get attention, to build interest, to create desire, and then sales is really about taking action. But one way to create interest and desire in the market for your solution is to say, oh, you're likely to get a raise or a promotion if you implement our product to solve the problem that you have, right? That's a good way to build interest and desire. So another way to use a customer success story, of course, is in a sales situation. There's lots of different ways to use them in the sales situation. You can use them for handling objections. So for example, if a client says, oh, or a prospect, not a client. If a prospect says, your competitor has feature X and you don't have feature X and I think I need it. Then you use the story of your customer who also thought they needed feature X. They bought your product anyway, despite their misgivings. And they found out they don't even miss feature X at all. And that would be a great way to handle that objection from the prospect. Let me tell you about a customer who had that same concern, and let me tell you what they did, right? Even just saying that you have a customer who had that same concern and it turns out to not be meaningful is a way of reducing the perception of risk on the part of the prospect. And of course, you can then tell the rest of the story. This is one of the reasons you have to have a lot of customer stories, ideally, because you're going to have all these different types of objections that you want to be able to handle. The way that you use these stories in the sales process is things like when you have a new prospect, you can use the stories for qualifying. You want to make sure that the prospect has the type of problem that you solve. So you might ask questions along the lines of, well, tell me about your experience with, the problem. And they might say, well, I had this. And so then the salesperson might say, well, we have a customer who had these things going on. Is that similar to what you're experiencing? And then the prospect will either say yes or no. And you can use that conversation to not just qualify the prospect to find out, do they really have the problem we solve, but you can also use it to find out some discovery information that you can then use later on in the sales process. Like, for example, it's really useful in the sales process to know the exact details of your prospect's experience of the problem, right? Because every prospect may be experiencing the problem slightly differently. And if you understand how this specific prospect is experiencing the problem, then when you go into the demo process, for example, you can use that information to show, well, you mentioned when we talked earlier that you're experiencing this problem in this way. Let me show you how we can solve that with our solution, right? And then then the solution is really tied directly to that customer's own experience. So those are some examples of how to use customer success stories in sales and marketing. Now, obviously, your own personal stories you're going to use in the job interview. There's always these questions in job interviews about tell me about a time. Now, there's a specific kind of framework you should aim for here when you're telling your own when you're telling your own stories. Um, Aim for like a 90-second story that's a minute and a half. Roughly a quarter on the problem, a half of the time is spent on the solution that you did, because the solution is supposed to show how innovative you are, how creative you are, how skilled you are at interpersonal skills, whatever it might be. And then, of course, you want to also include around a quarter of the time on the results. And of course, you do want to talk about how those results were somewhat transformative if you can. So that's for your stories about yourself. Now, the prospect story, as I mentioned, is often used for pitching the new product idea, right? So you can talk about the market problem and why there's significant impact out there to the prospect, why it's worth solving it, why the solutions that are out there are not up to the job, and how we can create a solution that's superior to that. And then finally, when you're doing bullet points, and this can either be on your resume or it can be on your data sheets if you still do data sheets. And we always have these on our webpage. Let me tell you about all the things that our product does, right? And those are often listed out in bullet points. And you can use this structure of the results by doing the solution as the sort of mental structure for talking about either the things that you've done in your own experience, or in the in your product data sheet. So here's just an example. Let me tell you, one of our customers achieved 10% market share growth massive market share growth using our product. In your resume, you might say something along the lines of, this is from my own resume, I turned sales around and the sales team achieved quota for 3 quarters in a row by driving a change in how we demoed the product. So the results were turning sales around and achieving quota. The solution was that I drove a change in how we demoed. And so that's the basic way of thinking about that structure. So if we get to the summary here, so the basic story structure is this problem, solution, and results, or PSR. There's 3 key stories that as product managers, we really should be good at telling. The customer success story, and actually I say there are 3 key stories. It's actually many, many stories, but in these 3 categories. Customer success stories, you want to talk about the struggle that they had and then the transformation due to your solution. The prospect story, which is the struggle that they're having and then they're not getting a transformation, maybe because they haven't found your solution yet or you haven't built that solution. And of course, your personal stories about what you did and why they, that essentially show why somebody should hire you, how your activities transform the business and potentially transformed you. And you want these stories to be emotionally compelling. Business results are not, although they're important to talk about. Personal results are, and those are the things that draw people into the story. So that's the deal right there. And we can ask a bunch of questions and things now. Oops, let me go back to my contact slide. So in case anybody wants to try to contact me, let us go back here. There we go. And if there's, oops, dang it. Sorry, I'm trying to use, there we go. Trying to make Zoom work for me. It's not always working. Okay. So you can put questions in the chat. I think you probably can also just speak if you want to ask a question. Have to unmute your microphone. Oh, so Shubham mentioned that maybe you can do an MVP for some of these products or the questions, and that's exactly right. That's exactly actually what an MVP is a way of, well, an MVP in general is a way of validating one of your business hypotheses or one of your hypotheses about your business. It's not actually a product necessarily, but it's a test. It's an experiment. And so one of the, if you have a product idea that you think, oh, I should build this solution, but you haven't done much market research yet, you can potentially build an MVP, which might just be a landing page, and drive some traffic to that landing page and see if anybody clicks on it, or see if anybody signs up for more information about this solution that you're building. Another thing to think about, I like to use Kickstarter as an example. So if you think about a Kickstarter project, are you guys familiar with Kickstarter? You can put yes in the comments, but anyway, Kickstarter is a site where you can propose a project and get people to fund it before you built it. And this illustrates a really important point, which is that if you found a good problem to solve, even if you don't have a solution to that problem, you can get people to pay you for the solution, right? That's what happens on Kickstarter. Those solutions are not built yet. They're imaginary, or they might have a prototype, but they don't have a solution. And what Kickstarter does is it tests whether the problem is really worth solving, because with basically the bottom line way of testing that, which is, will people pay me for the solution? And that's what Kickstarter is. One of the things I talk about when I talk about the secret product management framework, which is in the Secret Product Manager handbook, it's sort of the structure of that. I talk about how finding market problems is actually the most important and most valuable thing that we do as product managers, because that's where all the money is. You can build a really beautiful solution or product, but if it doesn't solve a problem that anybody cares about, nobody will buy it. I mean, literally, nobody will buy it. They won't give you money for it. I've unfortunately experienced that before. You don't sell any. If it doesn't solve a problem that people need that solution, they won't buy it, no matter how beautiful it is. But you can also, if you solve a problem that's really important, you can build a crappy product and people will still give you money. I don't know if you guys have Craigslist in India, but it's very important here in the States and a lot of places. Craigslist is a website that essentially does classified ads, and it has put a bunch of other businesses out of business, right? Classified ads used to be the main source of revenue for newspapers, and Craigslist essentially eliminated that market. And Craigslist itself is not a great application. It's pretty old-fashioned. It hasn't really changed much in 20 years. And yet it puts whole industries out of business. And the reason is because it solves a really important problem, which is people have a bunch of crap and they want to get rid of it, basically. And of course, they also make money on job postings and things like that. But the point is that you don't have to have a good product to have a successful business. You don't have to have a great product. You have to have a product that solves a problem. The problem is the most important thing. It's 10 times more important than whatever you build. If maybe 100 times more important. And Kickstarter, again, is an illustration of that. So anyway.
Cool. Thank you, Nils. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
This side. Cool, great. Okay. How about a time when there can be a scenario like customer don't know what they want? Like we don't know what they want. Like that's what Steve Jobs said, right? People don't know what they want. So how about that time? How you gonna distinguish that scenario in which the customer doesn't know what they want? And
yeah. So the fact is that really was not what he said was not. What he said was not really true. What they didn't know was what the solution to their problem could be, but they knew what they wanted. They wanted to be able to talk to their friends. They wanted to be able to. Well, one of the big innovations in the iPhone, I don't know if you guys remember this, but one of the big innovations was visual voicemail, right? Voicemail before the iPhone was horrible. It was incredibly terrible. And the iPhone came out with great voicemail, right? Where you could see who called you. You could call them directly back. You didn't have to remember any codes, anything like that. So one thing that he knew, because he was a human being, was that voicemail was horrible. And he said, oh, I think we can solve that problem. Now, one thing that's interesting about visual voicemail to me is that it probably cost more to do the legal side of visual voicemail than it did to do the technical side, right? You can imagine there were probably 50 lawyers working with AT&T to try to get their approval to enable visual voicemail at that time. And there were probably 50 developers working on the software. I mean, at most 50 developers working on visual voicemail. That was really solving a business problem via business as much as it was a technical problem. So the fact is that when he says they don't know what they want, what he means is they don't know what the perfect solution is. It doesn't mean they don't know what they want. People have always wanted to communicate, and they want to communicate better and more clearly, and they want to have access to stuff on their devices. There were tons of smartphones at the time that the iPhone came out. The iPhone just did all of those things much better. In in a less painful way. And plus it was beautiful, right? People like beauty. And so you put those things together and you have a thing that will beat the rest of the competition. But it wasn't that people didn't know what they wanted. They wanted a beautiful thing that would do the job for them. And that was what Apple delivered.
Right. Cool. Thank you. Thank you for your
Yeah,
answer.
of course. anybody so how do you get into this field as a fresher? It's very hard. It's hard to get product management jobs. Product management is probably the most popular job in technology, the most in demand job, and there are many people who are experienced who are applying for all the jobs. And so it's very hard to get into product management. There are lots of websites out there that have ideas for how to get yourself ready for a product management job. Some of them also include some assessments on, should I really be a product manager, right? Because product managers, you have to have a special brain to be a product manager. You have to be both detail oriented and super big picture oriented. You have to be able to talk to everybody. You have to be super good at communicating. And you have to be able to work through other people, right? You have to have sort of an intuitive, influential approach to things. You have to be very good at, communicating up and down and across, and to customers, to salespeople, to executives, to technologists, to customers, to prospects. So I would recommend looking at some of the various sources online for guidance on how to get into it. And I have some articles about that, and there's a little bit in my book about, what are the characteristics of a successful product manager that might be useful. So hopefully that helped you a little bit. Similarities between non-IT product management and software product management. What do you mean by non-IT? Like physical products or something like that? Okay. So I don't know that much about non-IT to be honest. I think fundamentally you still have to find a market problem that needs to be solved, right? So I mean, a Kindle's a good example. So first of all, most non-IT products, of course, have a ton of software in them today, or they at least are. Software is a big part of their creation at any rate. But you still have to fundamentally find a problem that needs to be solved. So you can do that exercise on the Kindle, right? What was the problem that needed to be solved? Well, people want to read books, and there's some people that read a ton of books, and they finish a book, and if they don't have another book to read right then, they're really annoyed. It's a problem for them. And so the Kindle solved that problem. It also is super light. People can carry hundreds of books at a time without, in just one simple, easy, light thing. It would be very possible for the Kindle to have failed if the market for people that wanted to read books and didn't care, wanted to read a lot of books and didn't care that they weren't real books, if that market had been small, it would have been a problem. So I think the fundamental thing on the non-IT products is you still have to find a market problem. But then in terms of the building of the product, that's the part where I don't know too much, right? Because the way you build a hardware product is very different from how you build a software product. So I don't have too much expertise in that area. So how to tell a story while writing a product manager resume. So I mentioned one thing, which is the way that you write your bullets, right? Is your bullets, every bullet in your resume, you should think of your bullets in your resume as representing the stories that you want to tell, or some subset of the stories that you want to tell about yourself, right? And so that's a good way to think about bullets. And your goal with the resume, there's multiple goals. Obviously, the first goal is to have somebody look at it for more than 5 seconds and putting it in the trash. But then, when you're actually like doing an interview, one thing you should expect is that people will look at your resume and they'll see the bullet points, and they will say, "Oh, that looks interesting. Tell me more about that bullet point," right? or tell me more about how you know, I had that example of how I improved our achievement of quota over 3 quarters, right? Tell me about how you achieved the quota over 3 quarters, and then you get into your story. So the bullet points should be the results that you achieved by what you did. So they don't really talk about the problem. The problem is sort of implicit. And I don't think that you typically write about the problems per se in the resume. Sometimes you can, and maybe in the part like, sorry, keep hitting my microphone. In the part about, you know, when you have your job, the job that you had in the company, and then you have the little blurb, the little paragraph, and that paragraph might talk about some of the problems that you solved. And then the bullets are really the results that you achieved and how you achieved them. So that's the way to do them. So the stories are still informing the resume, but they're not necessarily talking about the problems per se. Hopefully that helps. There are, of course, lots of guidance online, again, about writing resumes. So you can take that with, you can just take that advice I just gave and combine it with all the other advice you can find. Any other questions? So this is a great set of questions. I really like this set of questions. I think I got everybody's question. Let's see. And unfortunately, the audience where the problem involves them, I didn't give you a very good answer on, but that is a hard one, and I'll have to think about that. Maybe I'll even take that on as a podcast episode or something.
Right. So we are also up with our time. So thanks a lot for taking your time and conducting such an insightful session for pragmatic leaders. I'm sure everyone,
I'm really happy.
Right, I'm sure everyone will have some concrete takeaways from this session.
Good. Well, feel free to follow up with me if you have more questions or anything like that, and I'll send you a PDF of the slides, Prayush, that you can distribute.
Yes, I'll distribute it. Apart from this, we'll be publishing recording of the session at our YouTube channel. So I've shared link of our YouTube channel and Slack community in the chat section. You all can join us. And yeah.
Great. Yep. Excellent. Good. Okay.
Cool.
I will let me make a copy of that, and I will hopefully talk to all of you again soon. Thanks.
Thanks.